Here I am yet again with my cold open starting on my balcony. But I'm pointing directly at a tree that is right by my house, and here it is. And it gives us a little indication of where I'm going today. I'm going in search of trees, and I'm going to talk about trees as a metaphor for vocation. And I will say right at the outset that one of the problems with metaphors is that they're useful, but they always break down. Well, we'll get started and we'll see where it leads. Alright, well here we have a pretty nice tree not far from where I live, and you can see it's got a nice solid trunk, and then the trunk splits off into main branches, and then the branches keep going and they branch into other branches, and we go right up into smaller branches, right up into the sky. Alright, as I go walking around, I'm going to take note of a few trees, and I'm going to start here with a shrine on a tree, and this indicates that traditionally Cambodians, and in fact a lot of Southeast Asians, used to treat trees as having a spirit, and in this case still do, and this shrine is dedicated to the spirit of this old tree. And here we have one of the many flowering trees in Phnom Penh. This one has white flowers, and it also has a creeper that is growing up the trunk. Now here we have a tree where you can see some of the roots that are exposed above the ground. Of course they go under the ground and support the tree and provide nutrients. But you can see some of them poking out of the ground, and then when you go up the trunk you'll notice that it splits. In fact, it splits into 4 parts, and as we go up it splits more and more and more until we get into the canopy where there are a profusion of branches. And here we have a row of trees of all different shapes and sizes, some of them with thick trunks, some of them with thinner trunks, some of them bifurcated, some of the trees are flowering, a whole different set of trees. I really like the trunk of this tree. Look at how gnarly it is, how it's got all these different knots on it from various stages of growth, and the twisted bark up into its canopy. Here's an interesting sight. There's a tree that is planted up here, and you can see its roots are growing around the wall and down to find earth below. Alright, well I keep talking in metaphors about vocation. I've talked about life and vocation in terms of flowing rivers. I've talked about vocation in terms of multifaceted jewels. And I've also talked a little about them as trees and all of the various parts of a tree. And that's where I'm going to stay now. I'm going to give you a little caveat, that is, metaphors are never perfect. There are always problems with them, and there's a particular problem now with my use of metaphors, because I've now used 3, the river, the jewel, and the tree, for more or less the same thing. But that's because vocations or gifts are complicated. So I started with a little kind of anatomy lesson of the tree. I'm sorry that the first few videos were a little bit out of focus. It's been raining this morning and I wasn't able to pay close attention, but you get the general idea. And I'm going to divide a tree roughly into 3 parts. The middle part, the trunk, is what I'm going to use as my metaphor for the vocation that you have itself. And the branches that lead up from the trunk, whether they be actually branches of the trunk or whether they be separate branches in the canopy, I'm going to think of them as behaviors or activities that flow out of the vocation. And then the root system that is under the ground, I am going to define as the support of the vocation and the origin of the vocation. So it's not a bad metaphor. I'm also going to talk a little bit, and I'll probably give you some images at some point of the flowers on a tree and the fruit on a tree, and or to try to extend the metaphor, knowing that at some point the metaphor is going to break down. Now, I'm not going to do talking heads a lot here. Instead, I'm just going to show you photos of trees, some of them relevant, some of them not, but just so that you've got a little bit of visual interest as opposed to just staring me in the face as I ramble along. So these are all pictures that I took of trees, some of them in the rainforests, some of them on plains or wherever, riverbanks. Doesn't really matter. They're just like visual additions to my rambles. My main question today is, how do you identify your vocation? And that's why the metaphor of the tree is so important, because what we're trying to do is to identify the trunk, not the roots, not the branches, but the trunk. And I talked a little bit about this in a video a week ago when I talked about how I said that my vocation was teacher, but maybe under it was storyteller. Well, what I'm really getting at is that teacher is the trunk of my tree, but storyteller is one of the roots, and there are others too, which I will talk about in a little while. But first we have to talk about, how do we find our vocation? And it's not actually a direct process. I didn't search and search and search and say, oh, teaching is my vocation, and then I'll go find a job as a teacher. It was the other way around. I found a job as a teacher and actually really hated it when I took my first job, because I was teaching in a manner that was not very skilled, and I was teaching subject matter that I wasn't very interested in, and I was teaching students that I wasn't very interested in. So everything was working against me when I first started teaching. So at this point I can say that my vocation as a teacher was far from evident, because I didn't like what I was doing, and so I wasn't developing anything in any substantial way. But the root system certainly was in place. And there are many parts to the root system. I'll just mention a few. One of them is that my parents were both teachers. So I grew up in an environment of teaching and knowing a lot more about teaching than the average student. My parents taught, at least when I lived in South Australia, they taught at the schools that I attended. Gawler Primary School was where my mother taught, and Gawler High School was where my father taught as a chemistry teacher. So I learned about the school's workings from them, maybe dinner talk or other ways in which they communicated things about other teachers. The other teachers came to our house from time to time because they lived nearby. My sister did some babysitting for one of the teachers. There was one year when I drove to school with one of my teachers. So I was much more intimately aware of the workings of the school and of teaching than the average student. I was also interested in plays. I had been an actor since the age of about 11, and I acted in private companies and also in school plays. So I was familiar with dealing with an audience, with interacting with a group of people and watching to see what was working and what wasn't working, projecting my voice, and all those kinds of things. And I'd also discovered in my early days of teaching, even though I didn't really like teaching mathematics, and that's a long story which I'll get into maybe in another video. I didn't really enjoy teaching mathematics because I didn't understand how to teach mathematics. But I remember one lesson at one school where I was teaching. I really didn't want to teach that day. And so I said to the class, let's talk about astronomy. Just change the subject completely. And so I taught them about the constellations. I taught them about my favorite star, which is Sirius, which is actually a binary star. I taught them how to find Sirius in the night sky by finding Orion first, finding Orion's belt, and then using it as an arrow to point down towards Sirius. And I talked about Betelgeuse and how the different stars are different colors. Betelgeuse is red and Sirius flashes white and blue and so on. I was just completely caught up in the subject matter, and maybe because I was caught up in it, my class was too. They just got really involved and they started asking questions. And there's no more life interest in astronomy than there is in mathematics. They weren't going to go out and suddenly become astronomers or suddenly use my talk about neutron stars and fusion and all those kinds. They weren't going to use any of that in their everyday lives any more than they were going to use quadratic equations or the Pythagorean theorem. But they were fascinated, and I think it's in part because I was fascinated. So you can see my vocation beginning to sprout. The trunk that became my vocation was starting right then. But then after 2 years teaching mathematics in England, I left and went to the United States, first to take an MA in folklore because I had an interest in dance, traditional English dance, and music and song. And I did a master's thesis on Morris dancing, the history of Morris dancing. And then I took a PhD in anthropology. And in my second year as a graduate student, I was given a 150 student class to teach basic anthropology, which includes evolution, archaeology, linguistics, and cultural anthropology. And I found myself in my element. It was like I was returning to that one idiosyncratic astronomy class with my high school students, but now I was dealing with subjects that I just absolutely loved and I knew a lot about. And so I could teach with passion. And it was from there that the stalk or the
the rudimentary trunk of my vocation grew and expanded. After I got my PhD, I started teaching at one of the SUNY campuses, the college at Purchase, which has conservatories for visual arts, music, dance, theater, and film. And I was hired there in large part because I had an interest in music and dance. And in fact, over the years, I got an appointment not only in the anthropology department, but also in the dance conservatory, and I taught in the dance conservatory. So there you can see how my vocation as a teacher, it continued to expand. I kept trying different methods. I used to try different orientation of the desks, circle, rows, all kinds of different things, horseshoe. I tried question of the day. It was a great introduction where I started every class with going around and saying, when's your birthday, or what's your favorite comfort food, or what do you hate most, and we'd get everybody talking. I tried all different kinds of things to expand my vocation. In the process, I also taught different subjects. I taught dance, I taught little bits of music, I taught cooking. So if we go back to my video of last week when I talked about the things that make me happy, they include cooking, travel, writing. Well, we can add dance and music. You can add many, many things. But the point is that when they were woven into my vocation, then they started becoming the branches of the tree, which I suppose if you want to extend the metaphor a bit uselessly, you can say they flowered or they produced fruit. Well, I mean, they did in a way. They intertwined, they interacted with my vocation so that my dancing fed into my teaching, but my teaching also fed into my dancing, it fed into my research, into my writing. I wrote about the dance as well as taught about it. I wrote about cooking. I still write about cooking. I taste different foods when I travel, and I write about them, take photographs, and so on and so on. So that the whole thing becomes a living tree. The tree of my life, if you like. So now we have one final question, and I'm going to leave it with you and then maybe pursue it later. Or I may go on to other topics, I don't know. But that's my vocation. My vocation is teaching. It is built on roots of my family, of old interests, of my growing up. The trunk developed over the years and branches sprouted and produced fruit. But that's my life. I've spent most of my life contemplating how this tree developed. Now what I would like to know, what is your tree of life like? Stay tuned.